Grain Elevator and Processing Society is hosting their annual Jeeps Exchange Conference at the Kansas City Convention Center, February 22nd through the 25th of 2025. Jeeps Exchange is the biggest and best show in the grain industry with more than 400 exhibitors and 45 hours of education. It is the best place to find grain handling and processing operation solutions all in one place. Jeeps Exchange brings together industry professionals from across the world to help build professional networks and connect with the products you need. Come walk the trade show floor, take part in live demonstrations, innovation stations, and see new equipment. Make valuable connections through a variety of fun and exciting social events. Early bird pricing ends January 28th. Learn more and register at jeeps.com/exchange.
With over 25 years in the grain industry, Dependable Conveyor Systems will provide you with complete consulting and design capabilities. Our business approach of problem solving and creating efficiency will remove bottlenecks to improve productivity and streamline operations. Contact Dependable Conveyor Systems to help you achieve your business goals. We are committed to help you get improved uptime, energy efficiency, and low maintenance systems. We are here to meet your conveyor system needs and solve your problems. Visit dependableconveyorsystems.com and email us or come see us in person at Jeeps Exchange 2023 at booth 501.
Coming up is a conversation I had with a highly regarded supply chain leader within the agricultural industry. Organizations are always working to be resilient to overcome challenges and risks that come their way. As you know, supply chains are exposed to multiple risks, whether they be operational, environmental, or human-made risks. What are the decisions that logistics managers consider when evaluating the modes of transportation within the greater grain supply chain? What types of changes will take place within the transportation sector, tech sector, and agribusiness that will have a direct impact on the grain industry? And what's on the horizon? All that and more in today's show. Let's go. Hey folks, welcome to Whole Grain. My name is Jim Lenz, your host and director of training and education at Jeeps, where the mission of the Grain Elevator and Processing Society is about people and information and knowledge, and the mission of the industry is about feeding and fueling the world. Thanks for listening today and joining the network of thousands of other grain handling and processing professionals across the globe taking strategic steps to grow professionally. The Whole Grain Show will give you the competitive advantage to win at work so you can make more of an impact. In today's show, we welcome Dr. Bobby Martens. Bobby Martens is the Iowa State Institute for Cooperatives Endowed Professor of Economics and Associate Professor of Economics in the Iowa State University Department of Economics. Martens has over 25 years of logistics and supply chain management experience, including 15 years as an Associate Professor of Supply Chain Management in the Debbie and Jerry Ivy College of Business, also at Iowa State University. Bobby earned his PhD in Agricultural Economics from Purdue University and his master's degree and bachelor's degree in agricultural economics from North Dakota State University. All aspects of his current position focus on agricultural food and supply chains, logistics, and cooperatives. Engaged scholarship, that is working directly with companies to produce industry-relevant academic scholarship, is the central theme in his research. Martens published articles in supply chain journals such as Decision Scientist Journal and the Journal of Business Logistics, and in ag business journals such as the Journal of Agricultural and Applied Economics. And one other notable item, Bobby was raised on a grain and cow-calf ranch in North Dakota. Dr. Bobby Martens is about to put a spotlight on supply chain management within the grain industry. Let's get started. Today we welcome an individual who's done great research in agriculture and food supply chain management. This professional has great enthusiasm for transportation and network design. His name is Dr. Bobby Martens. He is the Associate Professor in Iowa Institute of Cooperatives Endowed Professor of Economics from the Department of Economics from Iowa State University. Welcome, Bobby, and thanks for your participation on Whole Grain.
Thank you for inviting me to participate. It's an honor to be able to be here. I appreciate what Whole Grain is doing and what Jeeps is doing. Great group doing good things for agriculture.
Well, we're excited to have you. We haven't had a discussion quite on this, and I know this is a topic that is hot right now for a lot of reasons. It's critically important, and so there's so much fluidity and change going on right now. So I think this will be a great show to introduce to our whole grain listeners. Now, to allow our listeners to get to know you a bit, could you share with our listeners a mantra or success quote that you live by professionally?
Yeah, there's a quote by Thomas Merton, and I won't give the exact quote, but basically what Thomas Merton says is there's so much noise and so many things going on in the world and so much hitting us that we need to be able to sort that out, to drive some of that noise out of our lives, to be able to focus on the things that really matter. And I try to do that in my personal life, but also in my work life, to be able to drive the noises out that distract us and try to get to the real core of the issues and the things that are going on.
Oh, great quote. No one shared that before, and so very refreshing to hear. Could you tell us now about your current roles and responsibilities as Associate Professor in Iowa Institute of Cooperatives, Endowed Professor of Economics, and why is working in the agriculture industry so important to you?
Yeah, just a quick background to be able to do that is I've been involved with supply chain management and transportation for 25 years now. So I hit my 25-year mark of being in that area. And that means that I've either studied in it or I worked in it professionally for a period of time as well. And I continue to be obviously heavily engaged with what's happening, not just with academic research. So, you combine that experience, and which is a little bit nuanced experience that some don't have, with this idea that, I've been in agriculture forever, growing up 4-H, FFA, through that whole process, which anyone who has that background knows that background and appreciates it. But also I continue to be passionate about the idea of food and the biology of crop production and livestock production and how that influences supply chain management. So it's a great relationship. And prior to becoming professor here in the economics department, I was an associate professor over in the supply chain management department here at Iowa State University for 15 years. So I've been at Iowa State for quite a while, relatively new to this role in economics, but I enjoy the idea of being part of the extension team here and doing work with producers, cooperatives, and others in supply chain management and agriculture.
Wow, such great depth there. I'd like to start the conversation from a very broad view and then dive deeper into some of the very fluid happenings that are going on today. And of course, get your viewpoint on what lies ahead. How does that sound to you?
That sounds great.
Okay. Now, I can't recall the words supply chain management being expressed as often as it has in the last 2 to 3, 4 years than any other stretch in time. Supply chain management in general, what is it and why do we care so much about it?
It's funny that you say that because I don't think it's been used as much as it has in the last 2 to 3 years. And it's interesting how supply chain professionals have been creeping out of the woodwork over the last couple of years, but it has been around for a very long time. It goes back and it has its roots in operations management and in transportation. And over the last couple of years, it's become more and more important because we notice it more. It's not that it hasn't been there. It's not that the ideas haven't been there, but we notice it more. So it's went from this term that someone might have heard about but never really thought about to now it's a household cuss word, I think, in some cases, right? People get so frustrated, and it seems that everything that doesn't happen right is blamed on a supply chain someplace, at least from my perspective. Sometimes it seems that way. So, but when think about what supply chain management is, I do think it's important to take a step back, and it might seem like it's semantics or, wordsmithing things to think about it, but there's a few things that are important when one thinks about supply chain management that I'd like to offer the listeners. And that is that supply chain management is the integration of supply and demand. And that word integration is really important because we have many supply chains that aren't managed. And I'll often joke, we've had a supply chain since the apple fell off the tree. And there's supply chains everywhere and they've always been there. But integration or coordination or bringing together is really important when you think about the management component of a supply chain. So to truly manage a supply chain is to make it work better and fit together better and work better together, both within a company, right, but across the spectrum of what a supply chain could be. And why do we do that? We do that for the end customers, right? The ultimate end customers that we are looking to serve. And they may not even realize what they want. For instance, with Amazon, 10 years ago, I didn't know I wanted packages delivered to my door, but it turns out that I really like packages delivered to my door, right? So there's an innovation component to that. There's the information components to it. There's service components to it. There's the product flow component to it. There's also risk that moves through these supply chains. So it's not this linear line of moving something from A to B to C to D, but it's multidimensional, can become very complex, both an art and a science, if you will. And that's really the idea of what supply chain management is. Why do we know it more now? Why do we hear about it so much more now? Because we went through some major disruptions where we, the consumers, have really felt the actual disruptions that have happened, as have all players through the supply chain.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Jeep's training and education program is proud to release Introduction to Grain Operations. This new course is a multimedia version of what was known as Jeep's 500, with dynamic graphics, video examples, photographs, multidimensional illustrations, animations, and interactive exercises. This course is sure to prepare your team for the work you need them to do. This is a great industry primer at a great price. For a limited time, Jeep's members may purchase the course for just $195. Non-members still save and pay just $295. For more information, visit Jeeps.com. I kind of like how you started that, a little lighthearted there. We're hearing so much about it, but a lot of depth, a lot of detail, even taking into account, like you said, innovation. Consumers' expectations have changed. There's been a lot of incredible shifts throughout the world. Yeah, not necessarily linear as people might take into account.
Yeah. And, if I may, one of the things that's been very interesting is since the end of the Cold War, so for about 35, 40 years now, we've been in this world where borders have become, less rigid, right? And global trade agreements have been signed by both political parties in the U.S. around the globe. And we've seen this really relative to historical flows, relatively free flow of goods and services around the globe, especially between the major trading countries. And that's been wonderful. In many ways, it's been really wonderful to see. Don't get me wrong, there are certainly winners and losers to that. As a whole, agriculture is a large winner from that. The U.S. agriculture is. So, but when you see that happening, much of what we tried to accomplish with our supply chains has been really around this idea of making them more efficient because we could. We didn't have to worry about the disruptions as much. And that's been really good. And when we've been through some disruptions now, those very efficient supply chains are not broken. They're trying to do what they were meant to do, but they were meant to be efficient. They weren't meant to be as resilient and able to recover from the disruptions as fast as we might have wished they could. And that's been one of the things that has made supply chain really come into the news and really been front and center. And that's one of the things that folks all over, many different companies and organizations around the globe are working to deal with. How do we become more resilient and be able to recover faster, but yet not give up those efficiency gains and the good things that we have from our global supply chains?
Very nice add there. So we kind of covered supply chain management. We've heard that a lot. Great response there. The other thing we're hearing a lot about is logistics. So just to kind of clarify that, when logistics is discussed, what is it referring to?
Yeah, so logistics is a part of supply chain. So if you will, supply chain is the big picture, and logistics happens within that. And the task of logistics is to create place and time utility. So in other words, the where and the when. And this becomes really important in agriculture, the where and the when. If you think about agriculture in the Midwest of the United States, you could think about it anywhere globally, but agriculture is very much related to the biology of plant or animals, right? And so if you think about the Midwest, most land in the Midwest is cropped once per year. One crop per year is produced. And as you move around the world, that changes, obviously. But when you think about that, you have one harvest per year. And when is that all harvest used? It's not used all at once. Obviously, it's used throughout the year, and there could be some left over that is carried forward to the next year, perhaps, right? We might have some that's carried in from the past year. But in general, a large portion of any crop is used in the year that it is produced. Now, when you think about that, the where and the when become critically important, because whether it's going into a renewable fuel or whether it's used for food or whether it's used for livestock feed, that where and when needs to be developed out. And it's logistics that creates the where and when, right? The demand creates the where and when. Logistics enables the where and when. And that's, practically speaking, that's transportation, our transportation systems, and inventory, right? So there's inventories that occur. And, this organization is a prime example of being able to think about that where and when, the inventories, storage, being able to think about product and where it is, and then when it is going to ultimately be moved to consumers and when consumers will go after that product. So that's what logistics is. I give you one quick example of logistics. So one fun example that I think is thinking about coal in Wyoming, and I'll often use this with an audience. If you've ever driven through the state of Wyoming, it's a beautiful state, a lot of sagebrush and a lot of antelope in Wyoming. And sagebrush and antelope don't tend to use much coal, right? But yet that state is very rich in coal. And as a whole, we use less coal than we did 10, 15 years ago. But coal is still very important for power, electricity, and for heating homes. Well, that coal has no value to those antelope and those sagebrush and into our least populated state, least population density state in the United States. What do we need to do? We need to be able to move that coal out of there. And practically we do that by rail. It becomes really important to be able to create it. So transportation creates the where and the when, and there's no value to some products where they're at. It's the value that is created at a different location and potentially at a different time. That's what logistics does.
Great example. Thank you. Now, there are many modes of transportation for products in general. When we discuss the transportation of grain, the options of modes of transportation become slightly smaller, but yet there are still a good number of options that are utilized. Of course, some modes of transportation of grain generally are not used. They don't make sense, such as pipeline and for some products and air, although seed might be carried. But can you share the various modes of transportation of grain in the world? And can you talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each of the modes of transportation and its role in the supply chain?
Yes. And when you think about moving grain, there's three major modes that are used to move grain. And one important one that we should never forget about, but sometimes doesn't come to our mind right away, is the water mode of transportation. So this is in the U.S. and around the globe. Our inland waterway systems is where this begins, right? So here in the United States, we can think about the Mississippi River, but not just that. You can think about the Great Lakes systems. You can think about the Ohio River, the Missouri River, moving both fertilizer and crop inputs in and our commodities out. And these are important globally. These inland waterway systems are vital globally. When you think about the rich areas of ag production where we live here in the Midwest of the United States, there's three areas like that generally around the world. The United States has it here in the Midwest. We have another area in South America, Brazil and Argentina, that has great farmland that is capable of growing large amounts. And then Russia, Ukraine right now, and war happening in one of those areas. Then you think about population densities. The population densities aren't near those great areas of ag production, right? So we move product to where those great areas of ag production are. Inland waterway systems and ocean waterway systems enable us to do that. Second one is rail, right? Rail is critically important because you're able to move large amounts by rail. So rail is really important to thinking about this movement, and very important here in the United States, but also important globally. And then, of course, truck transportation. That's the international connector. Water can go where it can go. You can't go everywhere. Rail can go more places on land, but still doesn't go everywhere. And then truck becomes that universal connector to be able to bring it out of the crop production area, right, out of the field, but also to the final consumers who are going to eat the product or use it as fuel or whatever that might be. So all of those three modes of transportation are critical, and they complement one another. One doesn't work without the other. And that's something that's important for us to think about. And to be able to just substitute or make modal changes from one of those modes to the other really quickly is very, very difficult to do because of the huge amounts of quantity of tons that are moved through those modes.
So that kind of brings up the question, what are the decisions that logistics managers consider when evaluating the modes of transportation within the greater grain supply chain?
Yeah, and that's a wonderful question. When you think about what's considered and you think about where product is going to move, part of it is the where, part of it is what the availability is. And I'll just use the example that we had from this past fall, because this past fall was interesting. And this ties back to this idea that these modes of transportation don't operate on their own. They operate in a network system. So they complement each other and they work together. In October, right, we saw the Mississippi River get to pretty low water levels, and, not necessarily historically low, but close to historic lows. And the Mississippi River, less freight was moving down the Mississippi River. At the same time, right, we have this ongoing drought in the western states. It seems to be creeping a bit further east as we look at the drought maps that we can look at. So less corn was produced in states like Nebraska and less wheat in Kansas, so there's less feed available. Well, one of the interesting things that happened this past year, as the Mississippi was able to transport less, we saw the need for more and more west, right? Rail helped move that corn west, right? Instead of moving east to the Mississippi River, the bases drove us to move corn west because there was a need for livestock feed and a need to be able to fill and continue to operate the ethanol plants that were further west. So this network, right? There's a trade-off between these modes on this network, and product moved from east further to west, and rail was used to do that. Truck was also used to do that. Now, the kinds of volume that we have, it's tough to move huge amounts of volume on truck, but rail was used to be able to do that. So those modes become important, especially as market dynamics change. So our demand for corn is quite strong right now, right? But our export demand for corn is relatively low compared to the 5-year export trend. So that is one of those demand changes that has put less pressure on the Mississippi River, because we actually don't need the Mississippi River quite as much now as we might have if this same conditions on the river had occurred a few years ago. So these networks, this transportation system works together to be able to move this crop out of here. A couple big takeaways from what I just went through. One is that one mode by itself doesn't distribute this product that we are growing anywhere, right? These modes all complement one another. Another takeaway is that we're not in some kind of a system that remains identical year after year after year. These systems are very dynamic, so the needs for the different modes of transportation really change. And then finally, a takeaway that I'll offer is we really need to continue to consider how important transportation is to us when we're in the Midwest, because we're not sitting on top of a large population. And without the Mississippi River and without our rail systems, we don't have easy access to markets out of the Midwest where a large amount of grain is growing. And this is the same for many growing areas. I use the Midwest as an example. This is the same for many growing areas around the globe. So those three things are really important to remember when we think about transportation. It's important not to only think about transportation when a system breaks a bit. It's important to think about transportation all the time and to make sure that we maintain reliable sources of transportation.
Very nice. You used the word dynamic. You used the word change several times. I mean, that's what this is about. It's sort of like a living, breathing system, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and it's always changing, and it changes based upon the demand need, right? So why do we have transportation? We have transportation to satisfy the demand needs that are out there to be able to get product where it's going. So the demand for transportation is going to change as our exports change, as our ethanol plants come online or go offline, right? As feed needs change and our livestock herd shrinks or grows, and all of that relates back to biology and what's going on and the amount of rain that falls from the sky and the amount of food someone from another country is able to buy and willing to buy from us relative to other international markets. So it's this complex system that drives the needs for transportation.
These are things that are going on in all different geographic regions of the world. A lot of adapting going on. Now, I would imagine a lot of our listeners are curious about the next stage of the conversation. We're at the very end of 2022. Could you break things down for each of the major areas by truck, rail, and by water?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And how about we start with rail, because that's a pretty interesting one right now, as you said. So rail transportation, critically important to agriculture commodity movements without a question. Our Class 1 railroads, there's 5 Class 1 railroads in the United States, but there's, over 100 railroads in the United States. Many people don't realize that. Some are short line, some are switching railroads. Rail has been very interesting since before COVID, since about 2018, rail has been interesting because rail service has incrementally suffered a bit over that period of time, meaning that we're expecting trains to show up and their consistency of showing up what we think to be reasonable within a reasonable amount of time hasn't been quite happening as much as we would hope that would be happening. And this is perhaps related to some changes that railroad management have put in place called precision scheduled railroading, which I won't get into in detail. And then, there's questions around all of that. Rail has also been through our major disruptions that we have seen with freight flows in the United States, which is challenging for railroads. But what I'd like to come back to is recently, one of the big things we heard of is the rail strike, right? This idea that we could see labor unions that work for the railroads strike. And Congress just put through a bill first through the House and then through the Senate, and it was signed by President Biden to make a contract between railroads and the labor unions binding so that there would not be a strike and that strike could be stopped. And this goes back to a 1926 act, which has some historical context to it, which is very interesting and perhaps a topic for another conversation, but really important to be able to think about what that would mean. I ask people sometimes to reflect, what would a railroad strike mean? And railroads, if this strike was not stopped by Congress, would have likely stopped hauling ethanol by now because it's a hazardous material, because you can't leave ethanol cars unattended without labor there to be able to watch them and so forth, which means that even if a strike would have happened this Friday, which is a date, by next week, Monday or Tuesday, right, later, we could potentially see ethanol plants full and not being able to continue to produce because they would have been full of ethanol, right? So that would have meant they're no longer buying corn, okay? And that you can see how that backup would work. And it doesn't have to be corn, right? You can pick any product that you want to think about and think about what that means, okay? So that's something. Now, the strike obviously is not going to happen, but there's ongoing challenges with railroad, and I'm not blaming railroad management at all. I think there's a lot of complexities that are happening between labor and management right now on railroads, and a lot of complexities that are going on with railroads thinking about how they provide service to all of their customers. So rail is a big one to think about over the next 18 months, but also perhaps over the next 3 to 5 years in agriculture to continue to imagine how are we going to be able to use rail and what is reasonable service and reasonable rates and what does that mean with rail? Because rail is a common carrier and by law, they need to provide reasonable service at reasonable rates and with reasonable dispatch. Now that's reasonable used in the same definition 3 times. So the definition of that can become challenging. But thinking about the role that railroads have with agriculture is real important. Move on maybe a little more quickly and think about the inland waterway system in the United States. So, we've had this fright this past fall with the Mississippi River being low. I read an article once that said as soon as the national media starts talking about something, the problem will probably go away. And I think it kind of did with the Mississippi River. We did get a few more rains, and the Mississippi River is in much better shape than it was for a while. But the Mississippi River did get quite low, and it slowed the amount of freight we could move down the Mississippi. And it also really increased rates for being able to move product down the Mississippi River. Mississippi River is not the only river that's low around the globe. When you look at the Danube and the Rhine rivers, very low water levels there. Not as much grain moves on them, but very important for energy movements, for coal, for heating oil, for other products. The Yangtze River in China is very low. Hydroelectric power is very important there. My understanding is that 90% of the rice grown in China moves in the Yangtze at some point. So very important inland waterway system. And, that's one of those that becomes really important to us when it's disrupted. So thinking about those water levels and maintaining our infrastructure, our lock and dam systems on that Mississippi River becomes very important. Continuing to explore other inland waterway systems is a great opportunity. For instance, on the Missouri River, we now have a port that's accepting fertilizer back in again. And around the globe, there could be more opportunities to be able to use our inland waterway systems. Real important systems to be able to think about how do we utilize those? How do we use the Ohio River? How do we potentially even think about the Great Lakes again? Still a lot of freight moves through the Great Lakes. What's agriculture's role in being able to make use of that from a network perspective? Then we can think about truck transportation, which is our other big mode of transportation. And truck transportation has been asked to do a lot more for agriculture in some parts of the world in the last 10 years, right? You think about the Midwest here in the United States prior to the ethanol boom, to many ethanol facilities being created. Much of our corn was fed, but much of it was put onto unit trains or shuttle trains and sent out of Iowa as corn, right? Today, much smaller amount of our corn goes out as corn, right? It's going out as ethanol. It's going out as livestock that have been fed. It's going out as distillers' grains. It's going out as something else. And what did that mean within Iowa? The need for truck transportation, as an example, this is a global trend. I'll use Iowa as an example. That means that we're seeing farmers take their product to the ethanol plant, right? This is happening through the Dakotas. This is happening through Illinois. This is happening through Indiana. So product is moving a greater distance on truck, right? So that product then spends more time on truck, more time going over roads than it would have a few years ago. I think this is also a very interesting one when we think about soybeans and what could potentially happen with soybeans. So truck transportation is important. One of the big things happening with truck transportation right now is this concept of a driver shortage, right? Or lack of driver utilization. How many of a driver's 11 hours that they can illegally drive in a 24-hour period are they able to spend driving? And that's a big issue for truck transportation. Another one that truck transportation must continue to consider is to continue to develop safety and to be able to think about safety and what's happening. Nuclear lawsuits and nuclear settlements for accidents or loss of life have gotten very, very, very large to the point where buying insurance is very difficult for some truck transportation carriers. This is one that will likely continue to see evolve, but continue to be able to perhaps limit the amount of trucks that we can add to our fleet as we think about more trucks. And I think for agriculture, this is going to become a bigger and a bigger challenge over the next few years. Any accident is not good. Any injury or loss of life is horrendous, but how much these settlements has grown to a point where insurance companies may not be willing to insure carriers, or they may not be willing to insure carriers at prices that carriers are willing to pay. And many of our ag cooperatives in the Midwest are faced with this challenge within the cooperative, right? And then you take that out to other players in the truck transportation realm. And this is not just related to agriculture. This is truck transportation nationally in Canada, in Australia, in Europe, and in other areas around the globe as well.
Great briefing of each of those modes of transportation. So much to consider. Thanks for keeping it global as well, as we have listeners around the world. You may have addressed this a little bit, but Bobby, what type of changes do you think will take place within the transportation sector, tech sector, and agribusiness that will have a direct impact on the grain industry? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, one of the trends that we continue to see is increased production. As we continue to see more and more product, we'll think about where does that product go and how do these international freight flows change? Like I said, 3 areas have a dominant amount of really good soils to produce really good products. And those 3 areas do much to serve global locations where population exists. So that will obviously continue to be very important. How do we continue to be able to serve those global locations from these 3 locations that are producing so much? So global flows will influence transportation and the need for transportation in those areas. Another one, I think, that is more tangible to us, or that we can more see a little bit more obviously, is the renewable diesel boom that could be on the horizon here in the U.S. and in other places globally. This could mean a significant amount of soybeans being used more locally, perhaps fewer soybeans being exported, and some changes in where production exists. Maybe more soybeans will be grown in certain areas and less corn in certain areas, or perhaps less cotton or less other crops in certain areas and more soybeans. These soybeans will be moved to these crush plants where the oil from the soybeans will be converted into renewable diesel. And there are many soybean plants that are being produced to do this, right, and are being proposed to do this. Some of them are being built to do this right now. That's going to be a network change that we will have to work through. Likely take more trucks to make that happen, but also different types of rail cars to be able to ship that biodiesel, or renewable diesel rather, right? Thinking about the soybean meal that will come out of those plants and how that will move to livestock feed or to other uses or to global destinations is going to be very interesting. So that's another one. And then I'll offer another one, a third one. And I think a third one continues to be this idea of traceability through our grain system. So if logistics is about the where and the when, where we're going to take product, how we're going to get it there, right? When it needs to be there. When we think about traceability for things like non-GMO, but potentially other sorts of crops that we don't even know about yet, right? We often think about different grades of wheat, right? Different grades of corn. What if there's new, nuances to what output traits might be in these crops, or other sorts of things that become important to consumers, such as identifying origin locations of where it was grown. So all of those sorts of things that are on the horizon and that perhaps we see a lot more globally than we do in the U.S., those become really important. Then we need to be able to think about systems that enable us to do that. Not just transportation, but that's where the inventory pieces of this becomes really important. When we're thinking about logistics, remember transportation inventory, the inventory pieces and how we segregate that and rethink inventory in a lot of ways becomes very important. Not only are we rethinking inventory, but we're rethinking transportation. So therefore, we're rethinking the networks to have the capability to think about traceability. So those are 3 that I think are on the horizon that could be quite big, and then, the fourth that's not quite as related is to make sure we continue to think about the capabilities to be able to move product globally, right? Not just in the United States. For instance, the Panama Canal was recently widened, and now we're seeing more freight move through the Panama Canal. What are the opportunities and perhaps the obstacles that might create for agriculture? There's going to be other factors such as that will play out globally to be able to think about how we pull our networks together and use our transportation networks and storage and inventory systems to be able to get food and fuel to consumers.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, the supply chain for grain is extensive and it continues to stretch globally. Supply chains are exposed to multiple risks, whether there be operational, environmental, or human-made risks. Ripple effects or disruptions can have various levels of impact on grain handling and processing related organizations and the supplier and service organizations that support them. Organizations are always working to be resilient to overcome challenges and risks that come their way. So many grain professionals have shared with me that they take pride in the fact that their impact goes far beyond their facility and their organization. They help feed and fuel the world. Bob, you help put a spotlight on supply chain management within the grain industry. Your insights and perspective are appreciated, and I have to say, you are an incredible communicator. Your student learners are very fortunate to have you, and any interaction as a human has with you is benefited by your talents and skills in conversation. So thank you for that.
Thank you for the kind compliments. I enjoy this and I'm passionate about it, and it's easy to be passionate about thinking about agriculture and fueling and feeding the world is just wonderful.
Thanks so much. Before we go, if any listeners want to connect with you, what is the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, there's 3 ways you can do it. One, I'll give you my phone number, 515-294-1350. It's my Iowa State phone number. You can Google me and come up with the Iowa State Economics Department and find my email address easily there. And I'm active on LinkedIn. So if you look me up on LinkedIn, Bobby Martens, Iowa State University, you'll be able to find me on LinkedIn. And I always like to be able to connect and follow what's happening on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you for spending time with Whole Grain listeners.
Thank you.
Have you listened to all the Whole Grain episodes yet? If not, be sure to do so. And don't forget to share with your network. You can do that right now. Let them know that the Whole Grain Show is not only found at jeeps.com/whole grain, but they're also found wherever podcasts are located. We've received a number of 5-star ratings already on Apple Podcasts. By subscribing to Whole Grain on podcast apps such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, Listen Notes, and more, every show will be automatically downloaded to your device as soon as it is released. And Whole Grain Nation, if you could leave us a comment and a 5-star rating, that would mean a lot to us, as it will help others discover the show more easily. If you and your organization want to sponsor an episode and be a featured guest on the Whole Grain Show, or if you are interested in us producing audio ads to support your product or service, we can also help with that as well. Please reach out to me, Jim Lenz, Director of Global Training and Education at Jeeps, the Grain Elevator and Processing Society. My email is james@jeeps.com, james@geaps.com. The Grain Elevator and Processing Society is the largest organization dedicated to advancing the grain handling and processing industry. Be sure to check out jeeps.com. Have yourself a great day, and thanks for listening to Whole Grain.